Hey everyone, it's Colin, how's it going? If you've watched many of my videos, you're probably aware I'm a fan of vintage Macs, especially laptops. But there's one I've been trying to get my hands on for decades. And I finally did it. The PowerBook 500 series was a very successful one for Apple. It pioneered some new technologies for laptops, such as the solid-state trackpad for controlling the cursor and dual batteries that could be hot swapped. It was much sleeker than the PowerBook 100 series that came before, and also made the leap to Motorola's 68040 processors for better performance. There were two main models of the 500 series, the 520 and 540, and each had options for black and white or color screens. The two were sold between May 1994 and June of 95. They received good reviews and proved quite popular. And for most of the world, that's where this story would end. But in May of 1995, something curious happened. One more model was introduced. I got a sinking feeling when the package arrived. I knew there'd be carnage inside. The only question was, how much? I'd been looking off and on for a PowerBook 550C since the early 2000s, but only saw them pop up for sale on eBay a few times. And when those units sold, they went for hundreds of dollars, well out of my price range at the time. There's good reason for the scarcity in the price, and you only need to look at the keyboard to see why. This model was only sold in Japan. In a stroke of luck, I stumbled on one being sold on Yahoo Auctions Japan. They don't show up very often there either, but using a proxy shipping service makes it feasible to buy from there these days. It was being sold by a used goods store, and the description said it simply wouldn't power on. The auction included the power adapter, so I figured it had been tested and the machine either had serious motherboard problems or was missing parts. And apparently, so did everyone else who saw that listing because the bids were staying low. I decided this one was worth the risk. Worst case scenario, I could swap the motherboard from another 500 series PowerBook. It was otherwise in excellent cosmetic condition based on the photos. And ultimately, I won the auction for the equivalent of around $160 US, which was a price far lower than I had ever seen before. Now, shipping from Japan to the US isn't cheap, especially for heavier items like this. So altogether, I paid about $250 for the computer, shipping, and the proxy company's fees. It was only when I received the package that I realized the seller wasn't actually savvy with technology equipment. Of course, there's the horrible packaging. One layer of bubble wrap and thin cardboard. It couldn't possibly protect a 25-year-old laptop, no matter how far it's being shipped. And all things considered, I'm lucky a cracked housing and broken feet is all the more damage it sustained. But cracked plastics is a big problem with this model. One of the main differences between the 550C and other 500 series machines is its larger 10.4-inch screen and black housing. The 520 and 540 have a 9.5-inch screen and two-tone gray enclosure. None of the case parts are the same between the two, either in design or in color. Even the hinge covers and feet are different, so I couldn't just swap over parts from another 500 series machine and have the 550C still look original. And something that twisted the knife a little more was when I went to test the laptop. It turns out that the AC adapter it came with simply had a damaged connector. I pulled out a spare, and the machine booted up just fine. Had it not gotten damaged in shipping, this 550 would have been an incredible deal, all because the seller simply didn't know how to test it. But it did get damaged in shipping and needed parts that would be near impossible to get. It's too rare of a computer to just get rid of, but I wanted a 550 that was in good cosmetic condition. So I bought another one. Of all the luck, just a few weeks after the first one arrived, another one came up for auction. It was from a different seller and had its own share of problems. It was said to not boot properly, and a picture of the back showed what looked like a broken screen hinge. But the plastic pieces I needed all looked intact, so I figured it would be a suitable donor computer. It actually cost me a bit more than the first one. The final auction price was a little lower, but I used a different proxy shipping service that I paid to inspect the machine and repack it more securely so it would survive the trip across the Pacific. And thankfully it did. This machine's best days certainly were behind it. One of the screw posts inside the left battery bay had snapped, along with a chunk of casing inside the power socket. The ravages of time have rendered plastics from this era very brittle, and that was the biggest challenge I'd face with the repair. I had never taken apart a machine from this series before, so I started with the first one. Since its plastics were already cracked, there'd be no harm if I accidentally cracked them more. I managed to find the original service manual for this model online, which was surprising, and even more so that it was in English. One of the pages notes that warranty service for it would only be available in Japan, so in practice, this English manual had to have been used incredibly little, basically only in the case of a Japanese person traveling abroad who needed an out-of-warranty repair. I decided to tackle the display housing first. One of the hinge covers had been broken and basically fell off, and the other popped out easily. Then I could use a spudger to delicately release the clutch cover. It has tiny clips that hold it on, and breaking any of them would be a problem. I disconnected the flat flex cable coming from the motherboard, then supported the screen with my hand while removing the two screws in the hinges. Once those were out, the display came free. I removed the front bezel screws, 2 at the bottom and another 2 at the top of the screen covered by rubber bumpers. I disconnected the flat flex going to the speakers and the wiring for the microphone. I pulled the bezel slightly forward to release a couple of hooks on each side, then I could lift it away. Since I knew they were working, I decided to remove the rest of the parts from the back housing. The Active Matrix LCD is made by Sharp and offers a resolution of 640 by 480. I also removed the bottom PCB and backlight inverter, and according to the flat-flex cable between them, the 550C had its own internal Apple code name, Bonsai. I repeated the same steps on the donor unit. The hinge covers were in better shape, though the clutch cover had one set of broken clips. Underneath, I expected to find a broken hinge, but instead, I found something more disappointing. Both hinges attached to the back display housing with a pair of screws each, and on the left side, the plastic standoffs were damaged, so the screws wouldn't hold tight. My best bet was to try to glue them back together. I used a version of superglue designed specifically for plastics to adhere the broken part of the standoff. The other one had cracks forming along it, so I added some glue to the outside to, hopefully, keep them from getting worse. I gave the glue a day to cure, and afterwards it seemed to have made a good bond. I wouldn't know for sure just how strong it would end up being until the machine was back together and some stress was placed on the hinges, but I was hopeful. Reassembling the screen was pretty easy. The shielding, inverter board, and LCD panel all went back in the opposite of how they came out. I reinstalled the hinges and the screws seemed to be holding in the repaired standoffs. Then I dropped the screen bezel back in and reconnected its flat flex and mic cables. I reinstalled the last of the screws and put the rubber bumpers back, then the screen assembly was done. It certainly looked better than before, and hopefully, it still worked properly. Instead of putting the machine back together completely, I decided to tackle the other part that had gotten damaged in shipping, the feet on the bottom. They can rotate outwards to raise the back of the laptop for typing, and while fixing these was totally optional, I just couldn't leave them broken. I wanted a 550C in the best condition I could get, and that meant the feet needed to be replaced. This time I started by disassembling the donor computer since it was in worse condition. Accessing the feet basically meant taking the entire thing apart, and while it isn't nearly as complicated as modern laptops, I still had to be careful to keep track of screws and not cause any more damage. After removing the EMI shield covering the CPU, I found a nice surprise, a RAM expansion board. The first 550 had been upgraded with an 8MB module, but this one was 32 megabytes, the largest you could get. I decided to pop it out so I could swap it into the other laptop. While the body of the PowerBook is made from plastic, it has an inner metal frame called the CPU stiffener to give it some strength. The feet are attached to it, and ultimately, the frame needs to be removed from the lower casing. The only part that didn't have to be removed to do this was the motherboard. But eventually I got there and was able to remove the screws that held the feet on. They're cleverly designed to work on either side, so only one part needed to be made. Then I got to repeat the entire process again on the first 550. From the outside, the bottom half of the machine looked perfect, but after taking off the top housing, I found a broken standoff. I glued it back in, and at least it's in an area that isn't noticeable. The feet got obliterated in shipping, there just wasn't much left. And since they had broken into several pieces, I don't think gluing these back together would have worked out all that great. So I'm thankful the donor machine had good ones I could use. It was an awful lot of work, but in the end, I got what I was looking for. A good condition PowerBook 550C. I even got a decent upgrade in it with that RAM module from the donor computer. Now, of course, back in its day, one could have gone a lot further with a larger hard drive, built-in modem, or the optional and now rare PCMCIA card cage, which fit into the left battery bay. But the best upgrade was a PowerPC processor module, which these days goes for a lot of money. Inexplicably, right after buying the second laptop, yet another 550 showed up for auction, and it had that CPU upgrade. It ended up selling for more than what I paid for both of my machines combined. Now that's not to say that a stock 550 doesn't perform well. While it has the same 33 MHz clock speed as the 540, it has something extra. a full Motorola 68040 CPU, which includes a built-in math coprocessor. The 520 and 540 only have a 68LC040, which doesn't. For programs that can use it, that coprocessor can give a solid boost to performance. But the timing of the 550's release raises a few questions. It happened right as the rest of the 500 series was being discontinued and replaced by the PowerBook 5300, which was Apple's first PowerPC-based laptop. Some 500 series machines even shipped with a sticker declaring them ready for that PowerPC upgrade card, which certainly sent a weird message and probably would have put off a lot of buyers had the computer not been so well received otherwise. I tried to find out why the 550 was only sold in Japan, how many were made, and why it was even released to begin with. Unfortunately, I came up short. Even after reaching out to former Apple employees from that time period, I just couldn't connect with anyone who worked on that team. The only information I could find was the same copied and pasted blurb found on a number of Mac history websites, but I can make some educated guesses. From what I've learned, there are a number of Mac fanatics in Japan, especially from around this time period. The Mac Color Classic is perhaps the best example of this, but certain other models seem to generate their own subcultures. The PowerBook 500 series was one of these, with owners often upgrading and modifying their machines to push the limits. A special, unique model would have been appealing to them, and Apple's cost to develop it would have been rather low since not all that much actually changed. Japan had always been a big market for Apple, so the 550C was an easy way to appease their customers. As for quantity, that's probably the biggest mystery. I have no firm information which I could base an estimate on, but my gut says right around 10,000 seems about right, give or take a few. The machine was on the market for about a year, but it was a niche model targeted at a niche audience in a single country. Clearly, it's the rarest laptop model Apple has ever made, not counting promotional items like the JLPGA PowerBook 170, which was just a custom color anyway. What's kind of curious though is the first 550 I bought, the one damaged in shipping, was manufactured in the US. But the second donor laptop was made in Singapore, and its motherboard had a sticker saying it was made in Ireland. I suspect what happened is that Apple's US manufacturing plant needed to retool to start production of the PowerBook 5300 and 190, but didn't have enough capacity to build them, plus keep making the 550. So manufacturing of the 550 was shifted to Singapore. My own 5300 lists that it was made in the US, so the timing does make sense. But it is a bit ironic that the laptop designed for and only sold in Japan was never even made there. Now, there's another PowerBook model that was, and had an even deeper cult following, but that's a story for another time. As for this project, I'm happy with the results. This machine isn't absolutely flawless, but it's complete and in as good a condition as one would expect given what it's been through. But it's also a bit bittersweet. I finally have one of my bucket list retro computers, but now the thrill of the hunt is gone. Sometimes the journey is just as interesting as the destination. But that doesn't mean I'm done with this entirely. You may be wondering what'll become of that donor laptop. It's too rare to let go, so it awaits its own journey. If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.